my friends, thank you so much for joining me today. I have a really exciting video, especially if you're into dupes. I feel like there's a very popular palette on the market right now. Granted, I haven't seen every review on it, but so far I've heard nothing but good things about it. And I feel as though I have found a palette, a drugstore alternative, that has actually duped 16 out of the 24 shades. That's really impressive. I mean, I do a lot of dupe videos, but to have that much overlap and for it to not be one of those just like cheap knockoff copycat palettes, you know what I'm saying? But just be an original palette in its own right that had been out before this one, and they turn out to have so much overlap. I found it to be very interesting. I don't even have the same palette on my eyes. I've got Tarte over here and I've got the other palette over here. So before I get into the dupe or the alternative, let's say, because the whole palette in itself is not a dupe, but there are just many dupeable shades. First, I want to talk about this Maneater After Dark palette. I think the packaging is just dynamite on this. It's a larger palette, but it's still a really like solid construction, nice and sleek. I love what they did with this kind of like shiny and matte lid to the palette, and it also has a huge mirror on the inside. And that takes me to my initial story about this palette. Not long after this had been launched, I placed my order for this on Ulta's website, and when it arrived to my house, I opened it up and the mirror was just shattered completely. Every shadow was fine, but the mirror was just in teensy little pieces, to the point where I knew some had kind of shifted below the protective sheet that was covering the shadow, and I thought, like, first off, for $52, I shouldn't be accepting any part of the palette as broken. But even if I wanted to jump in and just use the shadows right now, I'd be too scared to do so because of the minuscule pieces of broken mirror that I think had kind of shifted under that sheet and had maybe gotten into some of the shadows. But I was at least able to open it up and see that it was indeed a gorgeous looking palette, and I thought, yeah, maybe the hype on this one is really real, you know? I feel like whereas Tarte sometimes gets pigeonholed as always putting out the same kind of thing over and over, here, like, there was some fun color variety and not the appearance of a lot of overlap either. We'll get into that a little bit more. But I thought it looked like a really exciting palette that would be right up my alley. But I gotta say, Ulta does a pretty terrible job with packaging most of the time. Like, this was in a box that was way too big and it was just bumping around. Like, I'm surprised the shadows weren't broken, but the mirror, again, absolutely shattered. So I get online with like a customer service chat with Ulta, and I'm also thinking, I'm not going to reorder this from Ulta. How am I going to be able to ensure that this arrives not broken again? So I get my refund and then I'm going to order it straight from Tarte's website. That's my plan. But they do completely refund me. As I was chatting there, they asked for a picture of the broken palette. I showed it and they gave me my refund. But I do have to wait like a whole other week to get my fresh, nice palette in. And I will say it was packaged much better from Tarte. Smaller box, lots of tissue paper all around it. Clearly it arrived safely. But as I'm doing some looks with it, I'm realizing, yeah, these mattes are really, really nice, and I've always enjoyed Tarte's mattes and really Tarte's shimmers as well in some of their very like well-known palettes, like the In Bloom palette or the Toasted palette or the Tartlet palette. You know, that whole series of kind of smallish, aren't they, 12 color palettes? You know, they've got a really smooth formula. In this one, I noticed that same smooth formula with the mattes, but with some of the shimmers, they've changed things up a little bit. There are certain ones that are just almost like creamy type of feels. They've done some imprints in some highly shimmery shades, and some of these turn out to be actually a little bit flaky and hard to build. I don't find it to be just flawless quality across the board. I really don't. Actually, I find much more consistency in those other palettes I mentioned from Tarte, and here they're playing with a little bit of glitz and texture, and that can be fun. But like, for example, this is kind of like my lightest shade that I might accent a look with, either of these, and the gold is pretty pigmented, but this one is kind of chunky, you know, and I find myself having to build it up, and it's like the shimmer in it is not super concentrated or dense, and even when I apply it with my finger, I'm not really satisfied. Again, a pretty color scheme. I love the splash of yellow. I love the splash of green, of berry, purple, plum, rose gold in a lot of places throughout. Some really interesting and fun color decisions were made by Tarte, and we're not always used to seeing that, so thumbs up there, baby. And while some of the shimmers are just creamy and bold as all get out, there are some that are lacking a little bit or make you have to work in a little different way than you're accustomed to. Whereas those other palettes like In Bloom and Tartelette and Toasted, all that I've mentioned before, super consistent quality. The shimmers are buttery and smooth, just like the mattes are. And I will say I've done some looks that I've enjoyed with this. I think there's a nice like light to dark contrast. If I want something really dark and smoky in the outer corner, I can achieve that. Some fun warmth, but you're not glued to warmth in this palette. And I'm just looking through the makeup aisles like I do, and I realized that they have stocked this Wild Heart palette in store, which I don't know, either I hadn't seen it or I hadn't paid attention to it before. It's so funny because I decided to just pick it up. I thought, okay, 15 bucks. Why not? And I didn't like the sheer size of it. If you look at it compared to my Tarte Maneater, it's not quite twice as big, but it's a big old palette, and it's not something you probably just want to pop in a travel bag, you know? It's big, the shades are real spread out, these clear windows, I mean, are not the most durable, but again, you're paying $15 for it. And I wasn't even thinking at the time of the comparable, like, crossover quality this might have, but I've talked about this before. When your mind is like clued into a certain makeup thing and you're liking it and you're into it, I really think you become drawn to similar things without even really knowing it. And I think I was drawn to this palette subconsciously, not even thinking about like the certain pops that really corresponded with the Tarte palette. But I was just drawn to it, and I got it home, and I was even talking about the swatches on Instagram. I was like, what a pretty fall palette. And I was asking people, do you have this? Do you like it? And really very few people commented about having it, and it was about half and half split in people saying, I don't have it, but I'm interested, and then people saying, I'm not interested. So I start playing with this a little bit, and I get my new Tarte palette in, I start playing with this, and then I'm really starting to realize the similarities. And then one fine afternoon, I decide I'm going to swatch out every MAC shade in this, and I'm going to see how many of these correspond. There are 9 duped mattes in this palette, and then I tried it with all the shimmers. I've swatched out every single shimmer. There are 7 duped shimmers in this palette for a total of 16 shades out of the 24 in here being duped. And I will say, not only duped, but the quality in this Wet n Wild palette, the softness of these mattes, the pigmentation. Let's just throw up the matte comparison picture first. The top row going across my arm is every single matte shade in the Tarte palette. And then below that was every shade I could dupe, and you will see 2 gaps there in the 5th spot and then the 2nd to last spot. Those were shades I did not find dupes for in the Wet n Wild. But every other shade, I mean, look at that. The terracotta orange, the yellow, and you know, difference-wise, what are you seeing difference-wise? I'm seeing more intensity in the Wet n Wild row. I'm seeing more like just opaque richness there. I was shocked. 9 shade dupes there, and some unique things too, like the yellow, the berry. You know, this Tarte palette is not just a straight up neutral color selection. There are some interesting things, and those most interesting shades are also in the Wet n Wild palette, and then some, because this palette goes beyond and has so many other additional colors. Really diving into the purple deeper, some really nice cool mattes as well. But anyway, let's move on and talk about the shimmers. I swatched every shimmery shade on my arm. There are 13 shimmers in the Tarte palette, so I just went in order as they appear in the palette across my arm, and then I just started going through my Wet n Wild palette to see what corresponded. And here, you know, we have fewer dupes. We have 7 shades that I'll call dupes here. A couple maybe aren't just as exact as I'd like them to be, but the green, for example, the green in the Wet n Wild actually shows up much more true to color as a green on the lids than it does from the Tarte palette, just because the Tarte one is just that dark to be very murky and very barely there green. Okay, so the Wet n Wild actually has more true green. There's a little more depth in one of the kind of deep rose gold shades. The shimmery plum is 100% on point, but what I think some of these swatches revealed to me was that this palette sure has a lot of kind of like rosy bronze, rosy shimmer kind of overlapping. If you look all across that row, you know, you can see the first shade is really similar to, you know, a couple of the rosy shades later in the Tarte row. And what I find to be true about the Wet n Wild is that they don't have as many overlapping shades. While there are more colors in this palette, there's less really close overlap happening here. I found that very interesting. I would have expected the larger palette to have more shades that are coming just super duper close to one another. another, but really this is a palette of a ton of like one-of-a-kind shades. So for all you who got on my Instagram poll, a good nearly half of you saying I'm not interested in this, I say get interested in that if you would like to save some money. The Tarte one is $52. The Wet n Wild is $15.98. 16 out of the 24 shades in here have dupes, and where some of the differences lie are in maybe a richer pigment and texture in the Wet n Wild palette, I've got to say. So, I mean, this may be unpopular opinion, as I know so many people are enjoying this palette, and it is a beautiful concept, but this was out first. To be fair, this has been out a long time. This wasn't like something brand new. I remember when it first came out on Ulta's website, and frankly, I thought, I don't trust Ulta to ship that. It probably would have come broken, wouldn't it? But I saw it in person and I was like, you know, that kind of intrigues me. What really grabbed me was all this great matte stuff happening over here. It almost made me think of a snapshot of like that first Viseart classic matte palette, you know, right over here. But I like the rosiness. I like that it went all the way to black. And then the shimmers are fun to work with. There's some nice pops. There's, you know, maybe getting into a little overlappy with the gold, although I will tell you each one is different. Enjoy the purple splash here, some soft neutrals and kind of help you blend it out type of shades up in here too. It's a good quality palette. I will admit a bit bunglesome. I would love the packaging to have somehow been smaller than this, but whatever the case, again, $15.98 is precisely what I paid for it, and $52 is what I paid for this. So now I want to show you a little side-by-side tutorial. Again, I used my Tarte palette on this eye, my Wet n Wild palette on this eye. I just want you to see the application, the ease with which the Wet n Wild applies, the fact that I am not like building and building and building to match the Tarte. If anything, the Tarte needed to build a little bit more to match this. And yeah, here you go. You can just see for yourself. Alrighty, so with the Maneater After Dark palette, the first shade I'm going into here is Lust right at the top. I find this to be kind of like a rosy beige, and I'm just going to take that gently throughout my crease. And I'm kind of like cleaning off, wiping off my brush between each step. And then over here in the Wild Heart palette from Wet n Wild, I'm going to this shade right here, which is again kind of a rosy beige color. And I'm getting it in the crease, but I'm also kind of letting these shades come up above a little bit as well, so you can see them a little bit more. Then with a fluffy brush, I'm going back to the Maneater After Dark, and I'm going to use the shade called Playful. It's right up here in the corner. Just kind of a bone matte color, and I'm going to use that just to highlight and blur the edge right up under the brow. And then I'm going to use this white cream color right here in the corner from Wet n Wild, and that is going to highlight on this side in the same way. Okay, then I'm going back to my original crease brush, and I'm going to use this shade called Moody right here, this kind of purpley berry shade. Pick up a little bit of that. It is a matte, and I'm going to apply some of that to my crease as well. Gives the whole look a bit more of a berry pinky vibe. And then from the Wild Heart palette, I'm going to go to this shade right here, which I believe is the equivalent color. Excuse me, the berry right there. That's what I'm using. Outer crease, just gently working inward. Next up, I'm pulling in the deep shimmery plum down here in the corner called Nocturnal. I'm going to use a flat brush with this, and I'm just patting that here on my outer corner. I'm really wedging it up to my crease as well. And I will say, while I think the sort of printed effect on some of these shadows is fun, I don't always pick them up evenly on my brush. I find myself usually going back to those shades, making sure I'm deliberately getting shadow evenly on my brush, picking them up again, kind of having to repeat the process a bit more. Okay, so we got that on the outer lid and then wedged up into the crease. And then I'm taking my small pointed brush and just allowing that to blend even more with no product applied to the brush. Now from Wet n Wild, I'm going to this plum shimmer right here, so it's 1, 2, 3 shades from the side, picking up some of that. Both of these plums have a really murky quality to them. They don't appear super duper purple. The Wet n Wild palette definitely has some other shades that are more purpley than this. But just comparing the two palettes side to side, these plums are just so similar in finish and tone and just their very subtle purpley quality. Okay, so it's on the lid, it's kind of wedged up into the crease, and then I take this little small pointed brush and can make sure that the blend between that and my crease colors is nice and smooth. And then I found it really unique that both palettes had this matte, kind of medium mustardy yellow shade. So I'm going to go to that here in the Tarte palette. It's the shade called Desire. And I'm using a smaller flat brush, picking some of that up. This is going on the innermost part of my lid, okay? It obviously doesn't look quite so pure and yellow as it starts to overlap with that plum, but I think it's kind of a fun pop. And cleaning off my brush and going to the yellow right here in the Wet n Wild palette. Wet n Wild, interestingly enough, has done some little imprints on their shadows too. There's some hearts here and there. Very same yellow tone, if not a bit more opaque, just a little bit more on this side. Then I'm just going back to my Nocturnal color in the Tarte palette, getting a little bit on my small pointed brush, and I'm going to use that as kind of my smudgy, smoky liner on the lower lash line. And then right here, again, it's the third shade in from the right on the Wild Heart palette. Putting it really gently here on the outer part and letting it just fade on in. Alright, so it's Tarte on this side, Wet n Wild on this side. I'm going to finish it off with a little liner and mascara. Okay guys, so here's my finished look. I finished the eye off with some Persona pencil liner in brown just across the upper lash line, and then I used my Superhero mascara from IT Cosmetics. My lip today is a fun little combo. I feel like I've got, you know, some pinkiness, some berryness on the eyes, so I thought I would combine a pink shade with Live on the Edge, one of my faves. This is Lead the Way. I think this was the first one of these I'd ever used in this matte ink crayon format. So I've got both of those kind of blended together on the lips. As for the other products on my face, if you're curious, I'm wearing my CC Plus Nude Glow in Light from IT Cosmetics, my Born This Way Ethereal Light Concealer in Oatmeal. I set that with my Dermablend Loose Powder, and then I used some Glowish powder from Huda just all over my skin to make myself feel a bit more set, because this does give a very hydrated feel, that Nude Glow from IT Cosmetics. So this is in the shade 03 Light. My bronzer slash contour today is the NARS Laguna in the shade 02 Original. And then my blush is Natural Shimmer from CoverGirl. So thank you guys so much for watching this little review of two palettes in one that have so much overlap. The Tarte Maneater After Dark and the Wet n Wild Wild Heart palette. Again, this is nothing new. This has been out for, I don't know, over a year, I want to say. But so many key shades are overlapping here. Again, 9 duped mattes, 7 duped shimmers for a total of 16 shades. I do a lot of palette comparisons, you know, on my channel. When I review a palette, I'm thinking about what else I have that's similar oftentimes. And like I said, unless it's some cheap, like got it off of Amazon and yeah, they'd made it look exactly like a Naked palette kind of thing, you don't generally see this much overlap. So I definitely wanted to let you all know, let you know that the Wet n Wild palette is the real deal, and I would definitely recommend it. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know if you got any requests in the comments section, and I will see you again soon. Love you. Bye.